A parliamentary committee will investigate the relationship between the Liberals and the consulting firm McKinsey and Company. It comes after reporting that the value of contracts has increased substantially under the Trudeau government compared to previous governments under Stephen Harper.
We are having in place a shadow government because of these consulting firms, which is not only creating a lack of agency within the public service, demoralizing the public service, but also creating incredible waste.
There's an ethical question about the relationships with Mr. Dominic Barton. That's just a fact. It is my thinking that if we were to look at the other consultant class contracts that are out, we may find similar things.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is supportive of the study.
I welcome the work that the Open Government Committee, Operations Government Committee is doing as of today to make sure that indeed Canadians are getting proper value for money.
On Monday, McKinsey put out a statement saying that all contracts were won through a competitive process. Their work is nonpartisan, and they argue they're a relatively small player when it comes to receiving government consulting contracts. But of course, there is the politics of it all. To look at this, the Power Panel is back. Dan Moulton, Jamie Ellerton, Sally Housser, and Martin Partriquin. Something that is a part of this that is not necessarily getting the kind of attention in Canada is I'm normally based in the United States. I'm a U.S. correspondent. I'm just filling in just very, very temporarily here. But when you talk about McKinsey in the United States, it's a very different conversation because their name is linked to Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis. And so also a lot of lawmakers have had very public questions about McKinsey's role in relationship with China and the Chinese government. And there have been calls from specifically some Republican lawmakers for investigations on that front. However, McKinsey does do work with governments all around the world and other companies all around the world. So it is a big player in all of these kind of things. And just before we want to start, we want to make clear that no one on today's Power Panel works as a consultant for the federal government. Dan Moulton does lobby the federal government, which means they represent other organizations to the government. Okay, we got that out of the way. Let's jump in. Jamie, I'm going to start with you. What do you think about the decision to investigate here?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two things here, Katie. One's politics and one's policy. On the politics of this, the opposition party is going to make it look like the government is handing out millions of lucrative contacts to their friends. You're going to hear a lot about Dominic Barton's role in this. Of course, he was Canada's ambassador to China. He used to head the global consulting firm, and the company has got a lot of consulting contracts. So from the politics standpoint and what's going to generate headlines, I think you're going to hear a lot about that and trying to make the government look bad and tying government contact to handing out favors to their friends. But on the policy side of this, we've had tremendous growth in the public service under this government over the past 7 years, and yet they're still spending drastically more on consultants. So what are all these public servants doing? And I think when Canadians are asked, do you want public servants actually running the government, or do you constantly want to be outsourcing to consultants? That's going to be a question that I think gets a lot more attention. Listen, consultants have a role to play. I run a consulting company, and you provide the lift and expertise to clients that need it. But for the government of Canada, a G7 nation, to constantly on a perennial basis be outsourcing so much work to these private consulting companies, when you have a bloated and vastly growing public service, it asks the question, who's actually running the government? What accountability and checks and balances are in place to make sure that value for work is being provided? And if the consulting companies are doing all this, then why are we paying so many public servants to essentially sit at home and twiddle their thumbs?
Dan, what do you think about all this?
Look, I think management consulting agencies have for a long time had an important role to play in supporting the public service in every part of this country. Provincial governments, federal governments of all stripes have turned to them, particularly for specialized skill sets, technical skills, when you need a certain specific skill set that's not found in-house in the public service. You need to bring it in to help support the development of a program, particularly when there's a lot of IT needs associated with it. I think Jamie's right. There's been a growth in this that does deserve study. Whether or not we're seeing the outsourcing, the wholesale outsourcing of functions that should be inside the public service is worth studying. And I think the committee could actually produce a report here that may have some merit and may have some information to add. But I think Jamie's right. I think partisan politics is going to run amok here. And when you hear comments like there's a shadow government, quote unquote, operating here, I think we're seeing a little rhetorical overreach that only undermines the argument that the opposition is going to make and actually undermines some good public policy conversation that we could be having around this.
Sally,
Katie, if I can there quickly, though, this
Yeah.
is not rhetorical overreach, because when it comes to these things, we know that consultants' work doesn't get released and access to information and privacy the way public servants' works do. So their work gets cloaked in this cloak of darkness. There is no transparency, and that's very much part of the problem here.
Sally, what do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I think that this is why it's good to have a committee. As we always say, sunshine is the best disinfectant. I think where I'll focus strictly on the political here and the perception. This is where it really kind of goes to the heart of what is not a great kind of brand or perception of the Liberal government. It's not the first time they've had an issue of kind of friends and insiders. It goes to what I like to call the throw the bums out voters, whether you're Conservative or New Democrat, and go, oh, look at these guys again, just taking people for a ride. Real or perceived, that is damaging to the Liberals, and I think it's also damaging to Justin Trudeau personally as a brand, because it's not the first time we've seen the soupçons of this kind of idea that, oh, your buddies are getting the deals here. So I think the committee is going to make the most sense going forward, and yeah, on a public policy point of view, that comes out perhaps with some recommendations or regulations or clarifications to make for good government, but I'm sure we'll have a bit of a circus before any of that productivity actually happens.
Marty, what do you make of this? Do you think we're going to, that this sunshine is going to help disinfect anything, or perhaps lead to some policy changes that might actually make things better for everybody?
I do think it's interesting that Anthony Housefather, Montreal area MP, pushed to have this pushed back to 2011 to include the Conservatives. Now, it's obvious why he did that. He wants to spread the muck around. But, the Liberals that I've talked to privately, if you talk to them, it's kind of odd how much they don't like the civil service when it comes to doing these kinds of things. They think that the civil service itself is a shadow government, in that it sort of pushes back against what the government wants. It's much easier to go out and hire a private consulting firm to farm out public policy solutions. And look, there has been a massive rise in McKinsey type companies in governments across the world, as you mentioned before. They've sort of pitched themselves. It's a PR exercise. It's almost like this one-stop public policy solutions warehouse that costs you $35,000 a day, and we can fix your COVID problem, as happened here in Quebec. Or we can talk about immigration, as they did with the Liberals. That is a problem, and the unfortunate thing, of course, is this will be boiled down to a partisan politics thing. But the fact remains is that both governments, Conservative, the Liberal government, current Liberal government, and Stephen Harper government before, have availed themselves of these services, and that is probably something we should probably look at.
All right, we are going to pause the conversation there. I want to say thank you very much to the Power panel: Dan Moulton, Jamie Ellerton, Sally Housser, and Martin Partriquin.
Thanks.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, folks.